So the last area that we wanted to spend a little bit of time with is CBP, or Customs and Border Protection, and ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, oversight and accountability. So I want to speak just a little bit about some of the problems that we've seen, some of the concerns that we have already had, again, in recent years. This isn't a problem that has just emerged. We've seen increasing investment over the past several years in resources for immigration enforcement in the interior as well as along the border. And we are concerned about seeing a lack of accountability from those organizations, from those agents. In 2015, the Jesuit Conference, in partnership with Keno Border Initiative, published a report called Our Values on the Line, and it looked at some of the complaints and violations to migrant rights that were reported. That report notes that over 1 in 3 deported migrants report mistreatment or abuse by immigration officials. So that's an extremely high number of violations to migrant rights, and to concerns about mistreatment. Those complaints included things like verbal abuse, physical abuse, the separation of families, lack of medical attention, conditions in detention, not including belongings of migrants after custody. So these are violations to rights that we have been concerned about and that we continue to be concerned about. That report also found that the rapid hiring and inadequate screening and training, so laxed screening processes, were a really important contributing factor to the increase in those violations. And so we're concerned about this in this current context, because part of what the executive orders that were released in late January include is an increase by 10,000 ICE agents and by 5,000 CBP agents, Border Patrol agents specifically. So we're concerned that we might see the same pattern that we saw in fairly recent years with inadequate screening and training, and that will only result in violations of migrant rights. I also want to note that in recent years, Keno, as well as the Jesuit Conference, have worked on complaints of violations to migrant rights. And specifically, there are some mechanisms with the Department of Homeland Security where we can submit those complaints, provide information, details if the migrant is willing and interested in filing that complaint. And I would note that in our experience, the response to those complaints has been inadequate. It's been insufficient. So even on some very concerning complaints around, for example, physical abuse and the separation of families that puts members of the families in increased vulnerability. We've often received responses that there's insufficient information or that they're unable to substantiate the complaint. And so we're really concerned that would continue to be the case. And so really in this area, there are a few specific asks that we would make. One is to oppose lowering the hiring standards and to really request increased training for CBP and ICE agents. Here we've outlined what that might look like, making sure that agents are properly vetted, which would include mandatory pre-employment polygraph tests, as well as improved trainings that would include respect for human rights for migrants, and that should be based on real scenarios. So there are several organizations that work with immigrants and on immigration issues that have provided some of this feedback and suggestions on improved training, and we'd like to see those be put into practice. Secondly is to ensure that CBP and ICE agents are held to high standards of professionalism, and to do that by doubling the number of staff at the offices of professional responsibility. So we want to increase the number of staff, and that is to mandate that those offices investigate every complaint or allegation of corruption or of abuse. And then finally, to ensure that all migrants in detention have access to information on their rights and to how to complain about mistreatment. So right now we see that information is not always provided in the migrants' language of preference. They may not understand it. They may not have the necessary paperwork that they should be provided with in order to be able to express a concern or a complaint in that case. And so we want to be sure that they have the information that they need to be able to submit those complaints if relevant, if applicable, and if they're interested in doing so. Any questions on that piece?
Kristen, I think one of the pieces of the implementation documents of the executive orders, or the implementation memoranda that came out afterwards, talked about this influx in Customs and Border Patrol agents, and you referenced that in the talking points there. Is there anything else that you could share about the challenge of such a significant increase in the number of immigration law enforcement officials, and how will, just to understand, like, how will government pay for this? How will they manage such an increase? This seems like a significant number of staff that they would grow by.
Absolutely, and so we really shouldn't be seeing it very quickly if they're properly screening, vetting, and training all of those officials. But this is exactly why we're concerned. And I think we already are starting to see the impacts in the communities. Sometimes confusion between police and between ICE officials, and who is who. In some cases, collaboration and coordination and communication between local law enforcement and federal immigration attorneys. I'm sure many have seen the stories in the media that sometimes these are taking place, for example, outside of schools. Or a couple of weeks ago, we had a situation with ICE agents waiting outside of a church shelter in this part of the country outside of DC, and being detained upon leaving that shelter that the church held. So we're very concerned about that and how it encroaches on, for example, these directives around sensitive locations, the fear that it sows in communities. And on the budget side, I would say absolutely there exists some funding for DHS with which they can start to increase and expand these efforts and start to implement the executive orders. That said, they don't have sufficient resources to move forward with all of the different components that it entails. That will require further appropriations from Congress. And that really is our opportunity to speak, to ask our Congress not to fund this plan, and to instead fund policies, programs, services that will help to build our communities and families up.
Thanks, Kristen. And there was a question out there from the folks at St. Ignatius College Prep in San Francisco, who I know are excited to hear their name get called out. There they are. About what can Jesuit, communities do, whether it's maybe one individual or an institution like SI in San Francisco, a Jesuit parish, university, community, other concerned people connected to this network. Kristen, can you talk just a little bit about the impact of the legislative advocacy of reaching out to your congressional representatives and the impact that can make, whether it be a letter, phone call, email, things like that, and maybe about what you think might be the most valuable ways for people to do that outreach?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. So first, I would say there are so many things that you can do. The advocacy is one piece of that. There are also many pieces, many ways that you can be present within your own communities, showing solidarity, expressing solidarity with immigrants in your communities, with also in, for example, in detention centers, being visible, for example, holding vigils in your communities, for example. On the advocacy side of things, I would say pay attention both locally and federally. And I, at this point, can't thank you enough for your efforts at that federal level. I think, in our work here, really it is about the engagement of the broader network, because the voices from around this country, are what move the senators and the representatives that are here in DC. And without hearing your voice, they won't act. So that is why it's important that you both thank them when they do something that you're in support of, and also reach out to them and continue to push them on the asks that you have. We're in an interesting environment right now where, we talked a little bit on the Bridge Act about how there have been more Democratic co-sponsors so far than Republicans, and we've heard from a couple of Republican offices that they're, it's a hard time to be out there supporting these issues that they know are important. So when they do, it's extremely important that we thank them for their support across the board. That giving thanks and showing support, I think, is really crucial. And then in terms of the way in which we do advocacy, I would say if you can pick up the phone and call the office, that is wonderful. We, I think, have seen that has a greater impact than writing, although writing is also excellent. Please do write, but also call if you can. And the other thing I would encourage is a visit in district when your elected officials are on recess from here and they're back in their district, to develop that relationship and go back to them with the stories that you're seeing in your communities. Be sure that they're aware of them and what they look like in the areas where you live.
Thanks, Kristen. And the idea of IFAM really grew out of a desire not just to advocate legislatively at the federal or state level, but also to educate communities. That a form of advocacy is often helping people within our own communities to understand these issues with greater depth, to understand these issues from a human perspective. So there's a lot that can be done, whether it's sharing the story of an undocumented student who would benefit from legislation like the Bridge Act, or helping people to understand the impacts on families, immigrant families, that detention and deportation can have. Those can be really valuable, and not only for yourself, but also leading other people to potential advocacy engagement as well. And so that's a really important piece that could be on there. And we have some great resources on the IFAM website about the ways that your community can do some of that in community education. Kristen, there was a question, and I think this speaks to kind of the broader three issues of, legislation that is an alternative to some of the problems with the current trajectory that we're on with the new administration. Can you talk just a little bit about where we are in terms of, the administration, a Congress that is both houses are Republican, and just kind of some of the reality of what we'll see from legislation during this Congress on this issue? Just help us understand some of the landscapes, so maybe we can appreciate the type of legislation, how we might see positive things happen, in little pieces and bits here and there.
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and I think it's constantly evolving. One of the pieces that I would point to is, I think that the budget is really an important piece of this. We have seen, particularly on the Republican side, concern around costs and expenditures. And at the same time, these executive orders to be carried out in there fully will require significant funding. And so, that, for example, is where there is an argument around alternatives to detention for some, in addition to, of course, the concerns we have about the negative impacts of detention. There have been community-based programs that have been piloted that we can point to as an example of that. I would say also, in terms of the political climate and the context, at times I think we see openness to reform around immigration, and particularly for populations of dreamers, but sometimes it comes at the expense of legislation or policies on the border, and that is something that we're concerned about. And so there's an interest in tightening or making sure we have what we call secure borders, and that we will look at using detention less, or we will consider a pathway to citizenship and legal status once the border is secure. And so we're concerned about that, and that largely because I don't think that they can be separated in that way, and because despite so much investment in border security over recent years, we haven't, I don't think, necessarily seen that we're safer, and we haven't seen that migrants are jeopardizing our public safety. So I think that responds some to your question.
Yeah. And again, we were joined today by Kristen Lionetti, who is the Policy Director at the Jesuit Conference of Canada in the United States. Kristen joined us from our office in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much, everyone, for being with us today, and have a great night.